Hi, Mike. Good to have you on the show. Really excited to have you because you are leading, such a key role in the talent ecosystem across Southeast Asia. There's a war going on for talent, and you're the arms dealer. So excited to have you on the show. Could you share a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, of course. So I'm co-founder of Kaishi. We are a recruitment firm for the startup and VC ecosystem across Southeast Asia, headquartered out of Singapore. We're approaching 6 years old now. And I think the war for talent is a very real one. And thankfully, everyone's starting to understand a bit more about that. Um, I think it's really interesting. My background is I was a buy side, so private equity recruiter, and in Hong Kong, and then the past decade in Singapore, and that evolved when a lot of the private equity firms were early investors or LPs in the VCs in Southeast Asia. So I hired a lot of the early investors, sort of 6-7 years ago now, and then those guys and girls started pitching me effectively to help their portfolio companies rather than just hiring the odd investor. So I put a business plan together, went to my boss at the time. They said no, but I think like any founder, I had an itch and I couldn't stop thinking about it. And managed to persuade my first hire from when I moved to Singapore to join me and co-found Kaishi. We had no idea about startups. I had a bit of an understanding about VC, and and we sort of went from there.
Amazing. And could you share a little bit more about why you started a career in recruitment? Because, a lot of folks don't understand why people choose to be recruiters. So could you share more?
So I think like many graduates in the UK, so my dad's from Singapore, my family originally from Singapore, my dad's side, but he immigrated to the UK. So, but many grads in the UK compared to this part of the world don't really know what they're going to go into upon graduation. And so I ended up working in BD for a tech startup, but focusing on advertising and e-marketing solutions around talent and recruitment. So it makes me sound really old, but my job was to persuade people to stop using newspapers to advertise for jobs and start using the internet. So I did that for 2.5 years. Then my girlfriend, who thankfully became my wife, got an opportunity to move to Hong Kong. I said, I'll follow. So I quit my job. I really didn't have a clue what I was going to do, but everyone seemed to be hiring in recruitment at the time. And that's how I think, like a lot of people, fell into the industry. And then at the time, pretty shortly after I moved was the global financial crisis. So that was a pretty stark time for banking. But on the flip side, so much global money was flowing into Hong Kong in like the first wave of real sort of seeking out better returns in Asia. And that led on to founding Kaishi a number of years later. But I think my mentality was, well, I've been on the tech side. I like dealing with people and I've sold recruitment solutions, but now let's, in a very crude way, let's see the other side of it where people are the product as opposed to the internet.
What would you say are the biggest misconceptions about the recruitment industry for, tech?
Yeah, I think it definitely has a bad reputation. I think most services industry, you and I have spoken in the past about the management consulting world, and I think any services business comes with its ups and downs. I think a lot of the bad reputation though is because there's always another client. It's quite transient. It's a transactional sort of process as well. There's only so much we can do from a recruitment point of view as well. Yes, we can sell you the opportunity and what the startup is doing, but often it comes down to culture and click, particularly with a founding team, and we can help guide that in many ways. But whether someone likes someone or not, and vice versa, I think why I still have a job. I remember when LinkedIn came out and everyone said it's the recruiter killer, and it just became the biggest database on earth. But similar, likewise, I think the human nature is the unique part of it, and what makes recruitment so hard day in, day out. Because just because someone likes the opportunity, you still got to consider their husband or wife and their partner process. When people often have family, for example, joining an early stage startup becomes a bit more scary than when you don't have children or school fees or rent to consider as much. So I think it's a very complicated job, because at the root of it, we're trying to understand people's motivations more than anything else.
What's interesting is that you mentioned that it's a hard job. So what makes it hard? This isn't just a simple job where you just go on LinkedIn and look for a bunch of people, message them on behalf of founders who are too busy to outreach to them. What makes the job hard?
It was like that in the early days, particularly around when LinkedIn first came out. I think when it's hard, I think it's the sheer competition for talent. You obviously have to be pretty selective who you work with as a recruitment firm. You want to work with companies dealing with interesting problems and interesting products. And talent has no shortage of opportunity, and that goes beyond software engineering. Everyone, software engineers, get the press because of their salaries and that they're so heavily in demand. But if you look at how hard it is to hire product managers, or even on the business side with sales, marketing, and HR, the competition is pretty extreme, and it comes from a number of different factors as well. So you have no shortage of MNCs like Stripe and Zoom and Datadog coming into Singapore over the last couple of years, who then push up salaries, which is obviously a good thing, but it puts pressure on the startup ecosystem. And then, on the other side of it, we haven't seen enough founders and sort of early stage employees make that life-changing money to really be ESOP being part of the sell. So I think there are a few of the factors, but ultimately it feels at the moment competition is the biggest pain point in my job.
Yeah. What makes that dynamic happen, right? Which is the churn, the work, the trends. Is it because of the amount of money coming in, or is it because of the remote work where outside competitors can pull in talent? What are the trends driving this?
Yeah, I think the biggest factor is everyone talks a good game about talent and culture. I could probably count on my hands the number of firms that I've dealt with who actually really prioritize hiring best in class. And it's not just prioritize or saying that you want to hire best in class, putting the effort in to interview. It sounds so basic, but so few founders actually really are responsive and make it a priority. So I think culture is the one thing that, to be honest, I was very cynical about in my early days, but I'm a full believer now that people don't put an effort into defining their cultural sort of values day one, and then off the back of that, putting the effort and time in when it comes to talent. Then obviously over the last year, as you mentioned there, the remote working and the global sort of hiring of talent becoming very prescient. So we see companies from the UK or the US fresh out of YC. They don't have an office in Singapore or Indonesia. They have no intention. They can use an online payrolling company like a Deal or whoever to employ the staff. And for them, hiring a software engineer, even on a big salary in Singapore, is going to be a fraction of what they pay in the US. And I think it's great for talent in many aspects. So I think it's well known there's amazing software engineers across Southeast Asia. Often they're seen, in the past as low-cost talent hubs. Let's go hire a team in this country or wherever. Whereas now you've got the big boys knocking the door saying you're effectively part of our US team, but you work remotely. And guess what? You're paid incredibly well. So there's it's multifaceted, but the remote working and globalization of talent. And I think probably a better way to put it is the decentralization of tech hubs is a big one.
Talk more about that decentralization of tech hubs.
Yeah, so I think, traditionally you would go, where do you want to work in Asia? Where's someone going to move? And you'd go Hong Kong, Singapore, Tokyo. And a lot of startup ecosystems initially, built off the back of that. And even if you look at the big Indonesian startups that have offices in Singapore, I think often it started, you're incorporated in Singapore for fundraising and tax reasons. And then you start looking at talent globally, and people in the US or Europe or whatever, they may prefer with their families to move to Singapore, for example, traditionally. And the quality of life that they see and the schools, etc., is that they see as a lot more attractive. That used to be how things worked. I think there's still an element of that, but you can go and work in Bali, for example, plenty of schools, get a big villa, low cost, but on a high salary now. You can go work in, you're on a beach in Thailand and do the same. And then I think the other element of it is the remote working visas you're seeing popping up in Thailand, for example, in Dubai, in Lisbon. It doesn't sound like it's competition, but people want quality of life now, as well as a good job and a good salary. And that takes people away from these traditional hubs where they would live and educate their children and think, I would only move to a Singapore. Whereas now, particularly with things like crypto as well, Dubai and Lisbon are two key examples that have become unofficial global hubs. But I guarantee people are living all over those countries. It's just easy to get a visa these days.
Yeah, interesting. And I think that's really a dynamic where hubs have to compete not just on the fact that people could work there. I think that's what a lot of them were like, okay, come here because our jobs are here. But now that with jobs being in the cloud effectively, then I think hubs have to really compete on being a quality of life place, right? Where there's a quality of life for the spouse, the partner of the spouse, the kids, whatever that is, so that everybody can have that work and job security along with the quality of life. And I think that's an interesting dynamic that you mentioned, because that doesn't necessarily mean the traditional hubs win, right? So Silicon Valley seeing that, right? Where historically the only place to get a tech job globally was to work at Silicon Valley. And your spouse could also work there, right? But because the quality of life is so bad now, where the kids are not safe or it's perceived to be less safe, people are moving away from Silicon Valley towards LA, to the Midwest, to Texas, and still keeping their original jobs. And I think that's interesting because Singapore hasn't suffered that to some extent, because I think all the labor borders have stayed static to some extent. But I think it'd be interesting once this year's border lifts. What do you think would be the flows or the dynamics from there?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of studying what happens in the US as as the leading sort of country when it comes to tech because of Silicon Valley, and then you can draw those lessons, I think, pretty interestingly to the rest of the world. So there's a reason people move to Austin and Miami over the last year. That's because quality of life, better weather, and another big thing is really low taxes in those states. And it's a big advantage that Singapore still has a quality of life as well as low tax, whereas probably a lot of surrounding countries, the tax can be quite ominous. So I think it ticks a lot of those boxes of what you want to see. But as you touched upon there as well, people want everything now. You don't have to sacrifice like you used to have to. You want your spouse to have a great job as well and not worry about their visa. You want your kids to go into a great school and not have to compromise on that. You really don't want to pay too much tax, be it right or wrong. And you want to be in a safe and clean environment as well. So Singapore obviously ticks the majority of those boxes, but last time I went to SF, it was a bit scary compared to how it used to be when I was there a decade ago. So you can see why people move Miami, and I think we're going to see probably more people moving from surrounding countries into Singapore over the next year or so, as long as elements around education and the visa side of things and rent, which is often a big one, as long as those sort of chips stack up as well. But the competition, I think, back to the decentralization of tech hubs globally is where it's going to get really interesting.
So the Americans are fighting for Singapore talent. Singapore is fighting for talent across Southeast Asia. Historically, they had to fly into Singapore, but no longer. So everybody's working remote, decentralized across Southeast Asia. How else do you see that pan out? Do you see new hubs coming up in Southeast Asia?
I still think Singapore is going to be pretty dominant, although you're going to see some, like, I think everyone knows now, but you're going to see the Philippines really just erupt as a startup ecosystem over the next couple of years. The quality of founder, the quality of software engineer is pretty exceptional. Hence why we've seen like Axie Infinity, and when the global funds come, that's when it gets really exciting. And the global funds are taking up a lot of my time right now as they enter in the market. And it's not just liquidity; it's the size of check, it's the size of deal, it's what it enables those startups to go and execute on. But I still think Singapore is going to be, predominant. Fingers crossed for the time being as a hub, so to speak. There was a good article earlier in the week about how obviously Singapore managed to poach GrabDown from Malaysia a few years back, and I think it has that Delaware appeal to it. How you're going to incorporate your company there. US VCs want you incorporated in Delaware or Singapore when they come to writing their checks. Same as which is nothing new. Private equity firms have done it for years. But it has that lure then that they can get you down here, particularly when you have so many strings to your bow in terms of, as we talked on, but also when it comes to liquidity as well. Most of the big funds that you would see in Southeast Asia, up to the big guys like a Temasek or GIC, they've got a lot of strings they can pull to make it attractive to come to Singapore and move your HQ there.
It's interesting because you mentioned that as a result, there's almost a decentralization of Singapore or the talent within it across Southeast Asia, right? Because like you said, a Singapore engineer is either working for an American company, a Singapore company, or India, or they could be from Singapore but working in the Philippines or in Bali.
Yeah.
And then you're also saying that in the Philippines, there's actually a lot of mini hubs that can come up for sure, I think in blockchain and other associated dynamics because they're English speaking, because they have a high engineering dynamic. What else do you see in the rest of the region for Indonesia, for Vietnam, for Thailand? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, crudely, my business, like in my world, we follow the money. And so I think the number of big funds that are launching in Singapore or have done, and Indonesia over the past year and are doing so now over the next year, is what will drive a lot of what's going to happen. And a lot of people would scoff around that, but raising big checks at what they see as good terms compared to the US allows companies from the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, wherever, traditional lower cost hubs, to go out and hire best in class talent. And if you can pay best in class, you can hire then wherever it may be, and be it in Singapore, which obviously is a higher salary location. And I think, we've seen startups from the Philippines over the last 6 months raise huge rounds and then hire talent that they perhaps thought they could never dream of hiring remotely in Singapore. So I don't want to bring it down just to money, but I think when you see the check sizes increasing and you see the growth funds and you see the likes of Andreessen investing wherever, amongst others, that's going to drive a lot of the execution of what business is and the ambition. I think probably a lot more than anything. It's the SoftBank sort of 101 thing. Like that, the Vision Fund was almost like the precursor to it. But you go out and we'll give you more money than you could ever dream of at this valuation. But you got to grow into it and really go big or go home. And I think that's going to certainly be very interesting over the next couple of years in Southeast Asia. But the quality of founder and where people will invest is completely changed now. People are more than happy. There's tangible case studies of amazing startups in Vietnam, in Philippines, obviously in Indonesia. And fingers crossed, I think the liquidity events, obviously the markets are very up and down at the moment, but if when you see these companies IPO or get acquired, and talent sees that evidence of being able to do something and make life-changing money, I think that's going to make a big difference as well. I think the traditional public companies that are lauded perhaps a bit more old school, where the senior team have made a great money, but less so the rank and file employee, which is very different from the US. I think the other thing that I think is a huge advantage in Silicon Valley traditionally is acqui-hiring. So if you fail as a startup, there's an intrinsic value of each employee, because of how hard it is to hire a software engineer. But you're going to get acquired and have a soft landing. I think at the moment in Southeast Asia, we're probably more likely to see zombie companies just carry on for a long while and have a bleed of talent, rather than that soft landing that allows you to swing for the fences at the same time as well. So I'm really intrigued to see if we see a lot more of, you went after an aggressive sort of moonshot idea, as you should do with a venture capital backed startup. It didn't quite work out, but we're going to, there's plenty of options to be acqui-hired, and you and your team don't have to worry about the security of being in an early stage startup, which I think is one of the big secrets of success in Silicon Valley when you compare it to Southeast Asia at the moment.
Yeah, definitely agreed that acquisition is a common exit path in Silicon Valley and much more rare in Southeast Asia due to history, norms, number of potential acquirers, ability to integrate well, lots of different dynamics that, as a result, make a founder career actually more risky in many ways for the middle chunk, right? The people, the power law, right? So some people are going to make it, they'll still make it. For those who are never going to make it, they won't make it, and they have to learn and integrate. But that middle chunk of probabilities that could have been acquired in the US and done a good job creating value, regardless, and as part of a larger company, that fallback or optionality doesn't exist in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, correct. And I think it's a natural evolution of what we'll do, particularly as there's a talent crunch. You see a company struggling, they want to get acqui-hired. You can hire 15 engineers, 5 product managers, a good business finance team, whatever. That will add a lot more value to a business when you're struggling to hire more and more. So I think it's a natural evolution for sure.
What's interesting is that how should talent therefore think about joining companies? Should they join a later stage company or an earlier stage company or middle stage company? Or a company has already gone public, right? How would you steer them, or how would you hear their risk appetite in a way that makes sense?
Yeah, so there's no right or wrong answer because it's up to the individual, but I'm naturally more biased towards the riskier early stage startups because that's the sort of clients that we operate with. But we filtered candidates, for two main qualities, like what's their risk appetite and where breadth is the other one. So how willing are they to roll their sleeves up and help out across whatever may have to happen. I always say, if I hire a CFO for a startup, are they willing to do the bank transfer for the fee that I charge them themselves? If they're more than happy, they're probably the right person for a startup. Whereas I think traditionally in a lot of industries where you have huge finance teams and accounting teams supporting you, that shift from a traditional industry may not work so much when it comes to the breadth that you need to work in a startup. And then back to your question around risk appetite. If people have no risk, you can go join an AWS, for example, where those RSUs is real money. what that's going to be. You can join a late stage company, but I question whether you're going to make really a lot of money as an employee if you're joining a company that's about to IPO the next year or so, because the employees who were there 5 years ago have taken their share. So I think I'm always encouraging to go earlier stage. Worst case, you learn an absolute truckload. I think the second point to that is there's no shortage of startups willing to hire those people now who have taken a swing and taken some risk. But it's up to the individual and their personal circumstances. I have some good friends who have gone to the likes of AWS and amazing salaries, good RSUs, and that's very hard to compete with. I don't think they can actually leave by law within the first 4 or 5 years. But I'm always going to push people earlier stage, just because I think that's where the magic happens. It's really interesting, that 0 to 1 product market fit stage of a company.
Amazing. And there seems to be both like under and over appreciation of risk, right? Because I think there's some folks who are like, oh, I'm joining a late stage company and there's very low risk, in which case I often say, actually, there's probably a higher amount of risk than you think, maybe closer to like 20 to 30% or 40% for a late stage company. And then, like you said, I think there's an over appreciation of risk where an early stage company is seen as like extremely risky because of the business probability of anything else, which is you still in your worst case scenario get a ton of learning, and you get the salary and optionality. So how should people resensitize themselves to the accurate amount of risk?
Yeah, I think the first point you make around risk is probably the more interesting one, because traditionally, say if you're trying to move someone from a bank to a fintech startup, they're like, "Oh, my bank is so safe." Like, I was like, "Are you kidding me?" The amount of churn I've seen, banks without fail cut the bottom 10, 15% every year. If there's a downturn or whatever, I remember, I've seen over my time in Singapore, DBS is going to be acquired by StanChart because they're struggling. StanChart's going to be acquired by DBS because they're struggling. I've seen Barclays and RBS come in and leave again, hiring thousands, letting thousands go. I read a really good interview this morning about the new head of talent at Pear VC in the Valley. Talk about if you were leaving from his previous startup, Instacart, to somewhere else at the moment, maybe you're underwater with your ESOP, and you can really maximize based on where the public markets are right now, bearing in mind where the share price will likely be in a year or two. So I think, analysis of risk is often not done properly when it comes, like there is a perception that MNCs are automatically safe, or late stage companies are automatically safe, as if they don't all look at cutting talent when the share price is struggling, for example. So I think that's a really good point around looking at what risk actually is, and perhaps me doing a better job of educating talent on what's it actually going to be like.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because that's a fair debate between the risk of the company going under, going up. But I think, like you said, triangulated versus your personal career risk, right? So that's an interesting dynamic that I personally hadn't thought about. So thank you for that. So on that note, I'd love to hear from you. Could you share about a time when you have been brave?
Yeah, so I think it aligns quite well to what we've been talking about. So my son was 2 and my wife was pregnant with my second son when I decided to quit to set up Kaishi. So I had a very, like a lot of people, very comfy corporate job. I was getting paid a good salary. Nursery fees and school fees in Singapore are not cheap. And when my wife was heavily pregnant with my second, I had to make the pitch to quit, go down to obviously barely any money and go and set up Kaishi. I obviously had a lot of belief in myself and the idea in particular, but I look back on that and I certainly don't have that risk appetite today. I look back and think, wow, that was pretty brave for when I was 30 years old and in that stage of life where perhaps you start getting more settled. But I think for me, I sort of did the maths that I could go back to a corporate in 2.5, 3 years' time. But I did the sort of analysis that I had basically 2.5 to 3 years before school fees really were going to kick in on my eldest son. And that was the opportunity I had to take. I think I would have looked back on myself and my life thinking if I didn't really go for it and try and set this up, I would have regretted it. And I'm quite good at beating myself up. So I would have regretted it for a long time. So I look back on that, and obviously I'm incredibly thankful for her and my family's support, and definitely my co-founder support on taking a swing. But that, I would say, when I'm a lot older and self-reflecting for this today, was a brave decision to take a third of my salary, do an industry that I didn't have a clue about, but I was kind of gambling on the macroeconomics, and that was Southeast Asia was going to be the next big startup hub. We had early anecdotal evidence with Grab and Lazada and early days of Carousel then. But it was a very different world to how startups look and the amount of funding and interesting companies that we have today. So for me, that's my brave moment.
What made it risky at that point of time versus now you realize that you wouldn't take the same amount of risk? It sounds like you have a deeper awareness, a deeper appreciation of the amount of risk you took at that point of time. So could you share more about it? Like, I guess, being a parent at that time, what about it changed?
Yeah, I think at the time for me, it was, I think crudely, and perhaps founders don't talk about this enough, there was a financial element to it. It was like, I didn't want to limit my earnings, which I think you do in any corporate. And hence why I push startups and I push equity so much, because it can be really life-changing. So I really didn't want to put a cap on my earnings, which I felt, I would do in my career in any company where I was working for someone else. I think the two big sort of risk factors were around my analysis of what the macro would be. Would Southeast Asia become a large ecosystem for startups? Would there be interesting companies? Would it become like China at the time? India at the time was pretty exciting, but China was miles ahead. The US was where I was looking to. So that was a big element. I think the other element, and what I learned from my time in Hong Kong during the global financial crisis, was money will flood to low cost, what is perceived as low cost investment opportunities during a recession. So over the last couple of years, I've been obsessed that when the recession hits, obviously I didn't have the foresight that it was going to be because of COVID, but I knew, just of basic historical trends, there was going to be a recession after 7 to 10 years, because there always is. That once again, big funds would, but instead of going to Hong Kong this time, they would come into Singapore, Indonesia, etc., come into Southeast Asia. But that's purely just based off my studies and my thought processes, that those two things would be what actually happens in reality. Like, I couldn't tell you what the next trend's going to be. I don't really see that as clearly as I did then. But they were the risks that I was gambling on other people rather than myself, I suppose.
Was there an element, because you're also at a time a parent of two, that made it riskier or less risky from your perspective?
I think you have to do, I think for me, I wanted to do it while the kids were young. Like, I didn't have to deal with social pressures that they must have everything. I must, live in a certain place. And, for me, when they were young was the time to take that swing. On my last day of my corporate job, like, I bought my son like a really nice train set, because I was like, you're 2 years old and it could be a long while before I can afford to do something nice like this again. It sounds so basic, and I kind of forgotten I did that until we were just chatting. But I felt they were not going to notice if they didn't have less than others over that last few years. Now that he's 7 years old, it would be a very different, I think he's such more of a person and so more engaging, and you have a normal conversation. To take that risk now, I think, would be pretty tricky for me, mentally. Second time founders, I find the most admirable people, like, to go through the startup journey again and to put it all on the line again, it just blows my mind. So yeah, I have such admiration for those guys, because right now, I definitely couldn't go back to square one.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that you started talking about that train set, right, for your kid, and you felt like it was going to be a long time. Do you feel like there's truth to that wisdom, which is that you should become a founder because you want your kid to see that your parents are happy, and you're good with their career? Or because I think that's what I've heard. The other one I've heard is like, you should stay at your job because even though you're unhappy, you still can provide for your kids. So how would you think about that?
I don't begrudge that mentality at all. Like, I think you've got to do what you've got to do in life. From my point of view, I'd have looked back, and if I can't talk to my sons that I didn't risk it and go for it, how am I supposed to tell them to take swings in their life? I couldn't have personally looked at myself when I was older and give advice that I didn't take myself. So on the flip side, you've got to do what you've got to do, and you need I was fortunate. My wife has a corporate role, like she can. That was part of the risk-making decision. If we were both startup founders or both independent, that would have been a different decision-making process. But I'd always encourage people to sort of go after, this sounds so soppy, but go after their dreams. If you've got an idea and that itch that you can't satisfy, it keeps you up at night. I was so fearful that someone else was going to set up the recruitment firm for the startup ecosystem in Southeast Asia. And it's obviously not a zero-sum game. There's some amazing competition that we have. But I really wanted to, and I still look back and think we were probably about a year and a half, 2 years too early. But thankfully, we had some early wins client-wise. But yeah, I think there's no right or wrong answer to that. I think it's quite a personal decision. However, you've got to go take those swings, haven't you?
What's interesting is that I run into two clusters of people, right? People who are parents who are wondering about whether they should or how to become founders. And there's a second group where I meet founders who are reluctant or fearful about having children, even though they want to have children because of the perception of risk. How would you think or have that conversation with these two different groups?
For me, there's no bigger driver or motivating factor than providing for your family and giving your kids the best opportunity. I'll work every hour, and I have done it, under the sun to make sure that we do enough as a business to provide for them. The big argument against obviously all this liquidity right now is that if you're frugal and you have nothing as a startup founder, you come up with some crazy solutions that that lack of air will allow you to perform better and come up with innovative ideas. And I'm a pretty strong believer in that the motivating factor that children give you to go out and succeed and provide for them is a very, very powerful one that will get you up out of bed and working really hard every day. So I very much fall into that camp. We did an angel investment we invest occasionally off our balance sheet as well. And it's into a female founder with 3 children as well. But I mean, like I couldn't picture someone, a better person to invest in because she's so hungry, has a real downside risk. So I think that's the side of the camp I fall into. I appreciate the population's also crumbling globally as well. So I think, the non-child sort of argument when I have 3 boys is, I'm not going to fall into that camp.
Yeah, it's hard to be a recruiter if there's no more people left on the planet.
Yeah.
Conflict of interest declaration.
My octogenarian recruitment firm.
Well, I mean, you're walking the talk, right? You have kids, and I have kids too. I think there's a lot of fear, right, about raising a family because that feels like a large commitment. And then being a startup, founder is also a huge commitment. So thank you so much for sharing, I think, so many different aspects about what it means to be a parent founder. On that note, I'd love to kind of paraphrase the three big themes that I got from this conversation. The first is thank you so much for sharing about the misconceptions about being a tech recruiter, how you got into being a recruiter, what you learned about it, why you founded this recruitment agency, but also thinking through about the public misconceptions versus the reality of what you're actually doing on a day-to-day basis, both the easy parts and the hard parts over time. So thank you so much for sharing that. The second part was really interesting was the Silicon Valley versus Singapore decentralization dynamic, where we saw the unbundling of Silicon Valley as a hub for tech talent in terms of not just career opportunities, but also quality of life, education, safety, in the midst of a pandemic and the remote work push. What's interesting is that you then went on to contrast that to Singapore's position, where it has facing all of these pressures while also competing with American MNCs slash startups. So there's some labor arbitrage compression over time, but also talking about some of the other hubs in Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, and those trends that are happening there across Southeast Asia. So really interesting to see how that impacts the trends moving forward. And lastly, thank you so much for sharing about being a parent founder yourself at a time where you just made a bet on the trends and the back of the envelope thinking.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you sharing about how much risk actually is, right? Both in late stage and early stage, but also the risk you took on as a founder yourself. And I really appreciate the anecdote that you shared about buying that train set for your kid because you didn't know if or when you'd be able to buy a new one. And I think that's a really real moment for many folks. So thank you so much, Mike, for sharing your point of view.
Brilliant. And thank you so much for your time as well. And yeah, taking time out of your day to speak to me.